Welcome everyone to today's CIFAR virtual talk in our series on the theme, Science as the Exit Strategy. CIFAR is a Canadian-based global charitable organization that convenes extraordinary minds to address the most important questions facing science and society. We connect researchers with experts in government, industry, and civil society on timely and relevant issues to develop new ways of thinking and to promote change in policy and practice. I'm Rebecca Finlay, and it is my pleasure to host today's talk on government responses to COVID-19, economics, politics, and the role of scientific advice with Professor Tim Besley. Tim is a fellow in CIFAR's program on institutions, organization, and growth, and school professor of economics of political science and W. Arthur Lewis Professor of Development Economics at the London School of Economics. He studies how institutions shape economic policy decisions with particular emphasis on improving the quality of policy making and reducing instability. He has written extensively on an impressive range of important topics in political economy. No surprise, my favorite, judging by the title alone, is a forthcoming co-authored publication, Gender Quotas and the Crisis of the Mediocre Man. Tim has held several prominent policy roles, including as an external member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. In the UK's 2018 New Year's Honours, he was knighted for his services to economics and public policy. Today, Tim will discuss the subtleties of providing science advice to government during a pandemic, a timely and important topic indeed, and we are honored to have him with us. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's session will last 30 minutes. If you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Finally, this session is being recorded and will be available on our website next week. Tim, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's a pleasure.
It's great to have you here. Let's start with a more general question to frame today's discussion as we move forward. What is political economy and how does it inform your thinking around the role of providing scientific advice to government?
So political economy is a field that sort of emerged in the mainstream of economics, at least the way that I'm going to talk about it today, in the last 25 years, trying to understand not just what good economic policy advice is, but how you actually get good economic policy outcomes. So it studies the institutional frameworks in which policy advice is given and tries to understand what it is about the institutions of government that allow the best advice to shine through. It's not enough for economists to say do X or Y. They have to frame that in a context where it's the politicians who are going to act and own the policy. And so it's really about studying that whole process of economic policy formation in its widest sense.
Great. So you've recently written a column with one of your colleagues, Andres Valescu, and it's titled, "Politicians Can't Hide Behind Scientists Forever, Even in a Pandemic." And in it, you have a great line. It's, "Politics uninformed by science quickly becomes quackery, but science unmediated by politics is of limited use when it comes to solving a collective action problem such as a pandemic." Can you talk a little bit about this and how this relates directly to the experience we've been having within COVID-19?
Yeah, well, that's a sort of a line that I think very much came out of our study of political economy, in the sense of scientific advice, whether it's science from medics or epidemiologists or whomever, or economic advice, has to be effective if it's going to find its way into policy. And of course, we hope that policymakers will listen to that advice. But we can't forget that at the end of the day, it's the policymakers who have to own that advice, whether it be in scientific or economic advice, and act upon it in the way they judge. I mean, you cannot displace or try to displace the judgment of the political process. We live in democratic settings, a number of us for very good reasons, because we believe that politicians should be held to account for the decisions that are made, that There's a need for politicians to make hard choices. If there's a trade-off between some gaining and some losing from a particular policy, ultimately the legitimacy for that trade-off comes from the political process itself. And what I don't think scientists or any kind of experts can do is to characterize themselves as somehow standing above the political process, as if they have some sort of Olympian judgment that is not available to those we elect. It's really about working with the process and realizing you have to convince the politicians to act, and you have to provide the advice in a balanced and reasonable way, not pretending that things are necessarily all going in one direction. Very often it's about explaining the pros and cons, but ultimately I think it should enable politics, but not displace politics.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting area to dig into. And I think it speaks to this question of trust in institutions and governance, and the roles of institutions in society and how they play and can complement but also conflict with each other. I was reflecting on the work that we did here at CIFAR with our expert advisory group on society, technology, and ethics in a pandemic, when it was clear that we were trying to balance the technological possibilities of contact tracing apps and other novel technologies and the requirements for governance and essentially the establishment and commitment to a sustainable public trust. Without public trust, the apps would essentially fail. But trust in institutions is it's a hard thing to measure and to understand. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you think may have been some of the impacts of the pandemic on the trust in the different institutions we have in our societies?
Yeah, and let me add a couple of things. I mean, people will often say trust is hard earned and easily lost as well, and I think that often reflects some of what we experience. But I think in the pandemic, it's been particularly important the extent of reliance we have on compliance with various measures that have been taken, and how much trust we place in the wider populace to follow what might be called sensible advice, rather than thinking everything has to be solved through rules and regulations. So it's kind of getting that balance right between what you trust citizens to do and what you trust government to do is absolutely central. And I think what I've been struck by, both with my experience in the pandemic, but also reflecting on other countries, is how the institutional framework tries to get that balance right. And there are a number of dimensions I think that are worth remarking on. One is the kind of transparency of the advice. I mean, where's it coming from? On what basis has it been formed? Is the evidence base as solid as some people would claim? And it's important to I think be straight with people about that, not to overclaim what evidence can show, particularly in areas where the evidence is less than clear cut. And you build trust, I think, with a certain degree of humility and honesty, but you can't, in the end, throw your arms up and say, well, we don't know anything. That's not helpful either. It's kind of trying to get what I would regard as a reasonable default position, a position you can defend, short of evidence moving you away from it. And I think the art of it, and you can get to this in different ways, is to hit upon a default option that is supportable by evidence, and you don't feel compelled to keep shifting ground. Because if you go to the wrong place and evidence is repeatedly coming up to say you're in the wrong place, it will undermine trust again in the whole system, not just in that specific piece of advice. And so as much as possible, you try and get those default positions right as quickly and early as possible.
A little bit about what we've seen over the last several months with COVID-19 is that there's quite a dynamic nature to that interplay as the evidence changes, when the health advice evolves. And we see that tension between providing science advice and the role of the politician and the institutions of government. So there's a really interesting dynamic around this rapid response mechanism. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about DELVE, which is a group that's been put together that you're a member of in the UK, led by the Royal Society. I think DELVE stands for Data Evaluation and Learning for Viral Epidemics, if I look at my notes. And it's really trying to apply data evaluation and synthesis to different approaches that have been taken. And it's an interdisciplinary group as well, but quite rapidly developing this, this knowledge and information into government and the actions that move forward. Can you talk a little bit about how that has worked and what you think some of the benefits of that might have been, and maybe potentially some of the risks?
Yeah, so I mean, in many ways, DELVE is a reflection of what CIFAR's mantra is, because it's trying to be issue-driven and bring expertise, regardless of discipline, together based around issues. So I felt quite at home being a part of that, even though as an economist, I'm in a small minority. The disciplines, the many disciplines involved, epidemiology, public health, medical sciences of different kinds. So it's been a very interesting experience trying to bring a group of people together to work on problems and to produce reports, which we hope will be useful to informing policy. An example would be the report we did on testing, tracing and isolation, another one on the use of face masks. There's other reports in process. So trying to sort of look at the different approaches disciplines take to evidence, what kind of evidence they value. Let me give you an example. I don't think in a pandemic like this you can put too much weight on randomized controlled trials, not because they're not useful when you can have them, but many of the pieces of advice you're giving simply don't have an RCT evidence base. So if you said, well, we're only going to do those things that are proven by randomized controlled trials, we're certainly not going to get very far when the degree of uncertainty and lack of appropriate knowledge exists. So it's kind of then working together and saying, well, what evidence is persuasive, and also getting a wider perspective on the evidence. To what extent do we want to bring the economic costs in alongside some of the costs to infection? You know, there's been this balancing act, which I'm sure you're familiar with in Canada, of between trying to get the public health right and trying to get the economics right. Without compromising either too much, and again, through conversations within a multidisciplinary environment, we can sort of start to speak each other's language or understand each other's language. But ultimately, the view is we need to put out there the best of thinking that we can find, and then input that into the policy process.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I think the interesting approach too, to look out to different jurisdictions. So I often think about, this is one of the things that CIFAR finds really valuable in our process, is having research programs that are made up of senior academic leaders who are based in different institutions and different disciplines and in different countries, and being able to bring that together. We were able to hold an international consultation with several individuals based in the UK as part of the work we did on the Society, Technology and Ethics report as well. How do you find that, reaching into your international networks, understanding what's happening outside of the UK, to then be able to provide advice into the UK government?
Well, I think it goes without saying, I'm sure, as you know, that we are all academics, typically embedded in international networks. We're all a bit frustrated that we're housebound now and can't be participating in international conferences. I think Zoom has provided a platform, at least for us to stay in close communication with our academic colleagues around the world, because most of our disciplines are highly internationalized, and therefore we are all the time trying to look and see where the best knowledge is. Even though, you know, working in a country context as we are, I mean, we're trying to feed into the UK policy response. Much of the time it's, you know, well, what have we learned from country X or Y about how they approached it, and can we feed that in? What are the experts saying? Why are they saying potentially something different? You know, is there a justifiable reason for taking a different position? Does it just reflect the culture or institutions of another country? So when it's constantly trying to synthesize and understand those different perspectives to try and kind of work out what to conclude from that. And it's more, I mean, I'm slightly speaking against the title of this seminar, it's more of an art than a science, I would say, being able to sift the evidence and get that right. But at the end of the day, the science is a big input into the art, if you like.
Fair enough. That makes a lot of sense. So one area that you and I have just touched on briefly was around the role of the private sector. So there are many actors in an economy. All of them have different roles. Can you talk a little bit about the role that you see of the firms and the private sector as part of the pandemic response? So we think about public health and the public health response. We think about economic stimulus and innovation as a form of recovery out of the pandemic. But what have you seen in terms of the dynamics around the private sector engaging with the government or being part of the public health response?
So there's a couple of things on that I'd like to say. One is the sort of direct involvement in the private sector trying to deliver a kind of recovery phase. There is little doubt that we will have to get the private sector back into some kind of decent shape to provide the jobs and livelihoods for people who've been affected by the pandemic. But equally, there will be a different world out there, one where business as usual will not be possible in many sectors of the economy, at least for the foreseeable future, till we hopefully get a vaccine or a more effective treatment. And so it's a case of trying to work with business to make the best of what is a difficult situation. For example, what kind of testing protocols does one want in place? How does one encourage them? Are they a matter of voluntary compliance or compulsion? I think we all think that in the end, trying to get people to do things voluntarily is advantageous, but that's not always feasible. So you have to decide, where does the line lie between regulation and voluntarism? But many firms, particularly those that want to get back to normal business, have stepped up and started voluntarily to engage in public health measures. Not an entirely frivolous example is the professional soccer, to you, football to us, leagues, which have basically, in order to be able to be allowed to play again, have put in very rigorous testing regimes for players and staff. Because they realized that was the only route back to some kind of normal operation of their business, even though, in fact, all the fixtures are played behind closed doors. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, which I'll mention briefly, is the provision of data. So, you know, it's been very clear in this pandemic what a wealth of intelligence and information resides with the private sector. Whether they be mobile phone companies that are helping us to put up tracing apps or whatever, through financial firms that can have a much more up-to-date and up-to-the-minute picture of the impact of the pandemic on the economy. So one needs to form sort of public-private partnerships to both access and analyze data. Now, it raises quite a few issues, not least around data privacy, and so it's not altogether straightforward to know how you do that. But it has been, I think, an interesting feature of the pandemic, the need to forge those strong partnerships and to together to try and do the best. And I think some of this will outlive the pandemic, but new ways of looking at the economy through the lens of the data that the private sector has, or looking at public health measures through the same lens, will become something which we may say in the end, you know, we want to maintain this. This is important for creating more effective intervention and better societies.
That's a really interesting point. I think we've certainly seen in Canada that the wealth of data that we have within our health systems, many of them at the provincial level, really a renewed understanding of the value of that data and the capacity for it to inform research and decision making, you know, both in terms of when it doesn't work well, and then you know, in terms of public health surveillance and otherwise, but then also when you know, really the benefit in thinking about how do we sustain and support those data infrastructures in a way that will allow the research and work that needs to be done. It's a whole other question when you think about the private sector, and as you rightly admit, you have all sorts of constraints, consent-based privacy policies and otherwise that exist around that data. So what does that mean in terms of thinking about how to integrate that or not into government systems as well? And I think that will be one of, I agree, I think that is going to be one of the legacies that will come out of this time will be some understanding about what data and what systems we need to have within our government structures, and then also what the role of the private sector might be in that regard. We've got one question from the audience that I want to sort of drills into a point you made earlier, Tim, around public trust and transparency. And the question is really that oftentimes a politician will say that their advice is based on science, but they may not, in fact, indicate where they got the scientific advice from or what the evidence might be to support that advice. So how does the way in which a politician communicates about the science and the evidence base for their information, how does that affect the trust that citizens have in that information and in that advice?
Well, I think this is a very interesting question, because this has been, I think, one of the major areas where we've been learning as we go, in a way, through the pandemic. In many countries, people who were scientists in particular, who would not have even been known to the public, have become sort of public figures, because because politicians in particular have found it convenient to put them on pedestals and to have them directly communicate with the public, in order for them to try and answer questions and concerns that the public have. So sometimes, instead of the politician being the mouthpiece for this is the advice, if you ever sort of tune into the broadcasts we have in the UK, the press conferences, you'll very often find the politician will hand off the question directly to a scientist and say, this is one for the scientist, now please answer. Then the scientists can't hide at that point, because they either state an opinion or they don't. So then you can't just say a scientist believes. You really, figure out who's saying what. But I think there's a sort of wider background concern, and this is why it's been evolving through the pandemic, because initially the main scientific body in the UK, SAGE, there was not even any transparency about who sat on that body. And then at one point they were forced to publish the names. And as time goes by, people are asking for even more information. Maybe they should publish the minutes. For those of us who used to work in central banking, will be familiar with this. We used to publish our central bank minutes after every policy decision to communicate to the public why we were reaching a decision. But now that may become a feature of these more institutionalized scientific bodies, that they have to publish minutes, and then maybe they also have to publish some of the sources for those minutes, which particular studies, because as we know, it's rarely that you have just a single study that's going to convince you to shift policy. But if that's really what shifted policy, people should be honest about that. What was the evidence that was decisive? And so this has been a very interesting area to watch evolving. Countries will learn from each other. They'll look at what systems are in place and decide whether they want the more the system in which the politicians are put more on the pedestal, less on the pedestal, quoted, not quoted. But I think because this has all hit us in such a short time, we're very much sort of learning on the job as far as that goes.
Absolutely. So really interesting question around the politicization of science advice. So we've seen, for example, in the US around face masks and face mask wearing, that's become a rather partisan issue. So what advice would you give to scientists who are providing policy advice into government around how to sort of stay away from or to avoid the politicization of some of the advice they're providing?
Well, there's sort of one level of politicization that I think is in the hands of the individuals concerned, and that's the extent to which they want to speak out or not against what is palpably government policy. I think once you do that, you've kind of crossed the line, and you have, whether you like it or not, become part of the political process. And I think that's always been an issue that scientists or economists or anyone else face. Once you become oppositional, you do become part of the political process. But I think the way, kind of more generally, I think about this is to come back to this idea of a default policy, that I think there's sort of two stances you can take. One is that this policy is contravening your view of what the evidence says is a good policy. That's a very strong statement. Versus saying, well, I can't provide compelling evidence to move from this policy. I'm not sure it's right or wrong, But so I think there's a sort of difference between saying we know this is wrong versus we don't have sufficient evidence to move away from it. And I think it's when you cross that line into, yes, I know this is wrong, and you're willing to state so publicly, that you become, as I say, part of the political process. But very often science or economics or anything else you study is not so clear-cut that you can denounce something as evidently a bad policy. So a good example is the face mask, and I'll just mention this briefly, because I think early on in the pandemic, the view should probably have been taken that wearing face masks in confined spaces was the right policy. That wasn't the policy we took in the UK. I don't know for sure what you decided in Canada. Now, it's not because I could prove or anyone else could prove that wearing a face mask is such a great idea. I mean, it's certainly hard to believe it's a bad idea, but it's certainly not evidently proven that it's a good idea. So that should have become the default policy. But once you take the default policy to be you shouldn't wear face masks, you shift the burden of proof, and that's a very different proposition, which again I think is very hard to prove. So I think making those choices about where you think the presumption lies can make a lot of difference to the way the public debate evolves.
Okay, we have just a few minutes left, but I really I just would love you to take a moment, because clearly providing policy advice has been a part of your academic career right from the very earliest days. You've been involved in many different forms of providing policy advice. And I wondered if you could just sort of reflect on that. I think there'd be a lot of researchers on the call, on this talk, who would be interested to hear, why was that important to your academic career? And if there was an experience that was particularly rewarding, what was it?
So I think the time it dawned on me more than any other time was when I was a policymaker. You mentioned I was in the central bank during the financial crisis. And of course, there I was in effect a policymaker, taking part in the response to that crisis, only in a narrow sense of the monetary policy at the time. But a couple of things occurred to me that allow me to reflect on your question. One was that as someone who's that was just 3 years of my life. All the rest of my life, I've been essentially an academic. But what was interesting about that experience in terms of my academic life was realizing that there's two things that I think academics can really contribute. And that's often to provide a framework for thinking about the policy issues, which, while it won't necessarily resolve the issue, because the issue is itself very complex, you can, by framing it in a particular way, make transparent to those who have to make decisions kind of what the pros and cons are broadly of taking different stances, and where the evidence would definitely say you shouldn't do something versus where it doesn't prove you shouldn't do something, but it might be prudent to do it. So I think one of the things that I've always found rewarding, if you like, in engagement in policy is where you think you can make a contribution by framing an issue in a particular way. So I think that's a valuable part of what we do. And linked to that, academics can take a long-term view. I mean, even in the pandemic, where we know we got to make policy this week, next week, probably every week for the next 6 months. I still think lifting your head up a bit and thinking about the long-term implications is incredibly important. And if you get too sucked into the day-to-day policy, you often kind of start to lose sight of the bigger picture. Where is it that we're going and why are we going? And I think that's a very valuable asset that academics probably sometimes underestimate. Now, admittedly, you can't say I'll come back in 20 years and give you an answer when you're in the middle of a pandemic, but I think still being able to do slightly longer term thinking is really very, very important.
Absolutely critical, and a great spot for us to conclude today's discussion on. Thank you so much, Tim. That's all the time we have for today. And so before everyone signs off, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, and I'd especially like to thank you, Tim, for your insights today. Extremely interesting and useful conversation. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank Rachel Parker for her inspiration and organization of today's talk, as well as Daniel Bacinello and Jackie Sullivan in the proverbial control room. Please visit our website, cifar.ca, to find out more about this series and to view a recording of this talk along with previously recorded ones. Thank you all for joining us, and goodbye.